everyone's participation and attendance today. We'll start with item number 2, approval of the June 24th meeting summary. Farhad?
Madam Chair, I don't have much to report other than you have it in your packet and we're looking for a motion to approve.
All right, I'll entertain a motion for approval.
So moved.
All right, Carmine.
Seconded.
Seconded by Terry. Sorry, y'all, I'm going to use first names today. I hope nobody's offended by that.
Not at all.
Awesome,
Not at all.
thanks. All right, there's a motion and a second on the floor. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? All right, motion passes unanimously. Item number 3, this is the FY 22 to 26 TIP amendment number 2022.010, programming federal funds pursuant to the June 25th, 2021 NOFA. And Carolyn Laurie is going to do a presentation today. Carolyn?
Good morning. Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Carolyn Laurie. I'm the Regional Planning Coordinator for PAG. Thank you for joining us. This morning, I'll go through a quick overview of the NOFA that we released in July and kind of touch bases on the projects that was submitted and which one met our standard. Today, we're asking the committee for a recommended action for the management committee will be asked to recommend approval for an amendment to the fiscal year 22 to 26 transportation improvement program for the allocation of available STBG funds for RTA projects based on jurisdictional requests submitted to PAG. Okay, just a quick overview of the supplemental NOFA. PAG released the NOFA on June 25th, 2021 with associated attachments describing regional funding priorities. We also released the amount of $1,674,000 for surface transportation block grants or STBG. Program funding will be available for the projects. The deadline for requests was July 19th, 2021. NOFA priorities, project eligibility, and next steps. Programming of the regional STBG funds must be consistent with the priorities set for the delivery of existing RTA projects as directed by PAG Regional Council and pledged by the RTA Board. Therefore, only RTA projects are eligible for supplemental funding through the NOFA process. Preference was also given to projects that were already federalized. Only one request was submitted for the available funding. On August 11th, 2021, the TIP subcommittee recommended approval of the funding request as shown in the proposed TIP amendment, item 22.010. On August 18th, 2021, the Transportation Planning Committee, or TPC, also recommended approval of the TIP amendment. The Management Committee is asked to recommend approval for the TIP amendment to program available STBG funds for an RTA project, which meets the regional priorities and is eligible for supplemental regional funds. The project that is recommended is called Sunset Road, I-10 to River Road. Pima County is the jurisdiction and it's TIP number 10.18. The funding requested was the full amount of $1,674,000 and their fiscal program year was FY22. The project phase is construction. This project met all of the eligibility considerations and also has an active IGA. Okay, Madam Chair, with that, I conclude my presentation. Are there any questions for me from the committee?
I'll open the floor for any comments or questions. And by the way, it's kind of hard for me to see who's in person in the conference room because you're about 1/2 inch by 1 inch on my screen. So you're going to have to just speak up. Anybody who's on just audibly let me know if you want to be recognized.
So Madam Chair, Mr. Ortega is the only member that's in person.
Okay,
Else is
thanks.
remote, and we'll make sure we'll raise our hand for him.
Okay, thanks.
Or I'll raise my hand. Or I'll just yell.
All right, so this is a request for an action. If there are no questions, we'll be happy to ask you for your motion to approve.
Madam Chair, I move that we recommend approval of the project to the Regional Council.
I'll second that.
Okay. All right, I have a motion and a second on the floor. Any further questions or discussion? Terry, you're muted, but I see your mouth moving, so. Wait, you're still muted.
He's actually on his cell phone, so he would be muted on the Zoom, but on his cell phone, he needs to unmute, please.
Okay, unmute your cell phone, Terry. Yeah, no, can't hear you, but unmute your cell phone. Are you on the cell phone too? Did you dial in for that or no? Oh, he hung up the cell phone.
Well, we need to try it again.
All right, hold on, we're gonna get you there. You're gonna have to dial in, I think, on your cell phone again. Or call me. Oh, there you go. Try it now. All right, Terry, say something. You're officially unmuted on the screen. He's connecting. Okay, now unmute. You're connected to audio, now unmute again. Okay, well, whatever you did, it didn't work. Call me on my cell phone and I'll put you on speaker, okay? We'll figure this technology thing out.
All right, so we're gonna try my phone on speaker.
Yep.
So if you don't mind, just stay on, I'll put you on speaker.
We're working on it here.
Okay, we might get some feedback, but here we go. Let's give it a try. Yeah, no, I'm sorry.
Or 13.
That's not working. So if you don't mind, can you please hang up your cell phone and try that?
This is technology.
Again with the webinar ID and participant ID again.
Okay, can you hear me now? Is it working now?
Yes, it is.
Good job, well done.
Success.
I can hear you on the
Oh,
phone.
you did,
Nobody
you're
else can
amazing.
hear you in the meeting, so try
You gotta repeat it though.
the webinar number again and the participant ID, and hopefully you can log in again.
All right, Terry's on the Zoom.
It's good.
You can hear
All
me?
right, I think
Yeah, we can
whatever
hear
you
you
did,
on
it worked.
Zoom.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Well, you would think after like a year and a half of doing Zoom calls, I would have this mastered by now, but obviously not. So my apologies. I don't know what happened today. So my question has to deal with the number of projects that were submitted and how many were actually approved. So my understanding, there was only one project out of those that were submitted that were approved that met the standards?
Yes, Madam Chair, members of the committee, we had 4 applications that were submitted. And this was, out of the 4, this is the only one that met all of our requirements. And if you'd like, I can go back through those requirements for you.
Actually, Madam Chair, Carolyn, for this category, this was the only application. We had other categories, and I believe the other 3 applications were not for this category. They were for a different category.
Okay, all right. See, all that for naught. So my apologies. Back to Carmine's motion and the second from Mike. I guess we have a motion and a second on the floor, so I'll
All
turn it
right.
over to Madam Chair.
Great. All right, any other questions or discussion? All right, not seeing or hearing any, I'll take a vote. All those in favor of the motion to recommend the tip amendment to the PAG committee signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, motion passes unanimously. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, item number 4, the 2021 PAG Title VI Implementation Plan. Nathan Barrett.
Okay.
Floor is yours.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act requires that federally funded programs and activities be free of discrimination. And PAG's Title VI Implementation Plan outlines the manner in which PAG ensures that its activities comply with that requirement. PAG is required to update the implementation plan on an annual basis. PAG also maintains a non-discrimination policy and a limited English proficiency plan, or LEP plan. That LEP plan is also updated annually using current demographic information from the Census Bureau office. ADOT has reviewed these 3 draft documents and finds them acceptable. The next step in this process will be review and approval by the Regional Council. Today, we are asking the Management Committee to recommend approval and adoption of the 2021 PAG Title VI Implementation Plan. I can answer any questions you have about Title VI for this plan.
Okay, thank you so much, Nathan. Any questions, comments, concerns that any member of the committee would like to address?
Madam Chair. So I know the plan is attached. Could staff just briefly highlight if there were any major changes from the previously adopted plan?
The biggest change has been adaptation to how we run public meetings. Public meetings now are often virtual, sometimes hybrid. So the Title VI plan has been adapted to the current situation regarding public meetings.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions on this item? Any further discussion? All right, seeing none, I will entertain a motion to recommend the approval of the PAG Title VI Implementation Plan to the PAG committee.
So moved.
Okay, motion is made. Second?
Second.
Okay, second by Carmine. Any further discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Aye. Any opposed? All right, motion passes unanimously. All right, our last item on the agenda is the Federal Infrastructure Bill update. David Zinda is going to be our presenter today. David, turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. It is a pleasure to speak to you today. In this, my inaugural presentation as your policy analyst in the Pima Association of Governments. So of course, as you can see, we're going to discuss today the Federal Infrastructure Bill, which is currently going through the legislative process. This bill is formally known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Colloquially in the media, it is often referred to as the Senate Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, or in shorthand, the BIB. So the roadmap going forward, I'll just provide a brief overview of federal transportation authorization bills. We'll look at some of the top line numbers of the Senate bill. I will then highlight some of the differences in program funding compared to what we have been seeing under the last transportation bill, known as the FAST Act. We'll conclude with the next steps to passage and enactment. As you all may know, federal transportation is vitally important to our region's ability to deliver transportation projects and programs. This is why we closely follow these transportation authorization bills. The current transportation authorization bill, or the FAST Act, shares similarities with many of the previous bills we've seen before. It defines the manner in which funds can be drawn from the Highway Trust Fund, a user revenue fund, for a set period of time. Additionally, it outlines the funding of programs, their rules, authorization, and upper limit dollar amounts available to each program. Lastly, it prescribes how funding is distributed to states, MPOs, and other agencies. New projects cannot obligate, or rather withdraw, funds from the Highway Trust Fund once an authorization expires. Congress has frequently used a continuing resolution to extend previous authorizations. For example, the FAST Act expired in September 2020, but as you recall, was extended 1 year. Currently, the FAST Act extension is set to expire at the end of this month on the 30th. If the new infrastructure plan is not enacted, a continuing resolution will be required to ensure funding. So this new Senate bill would reauthorize Highway Trust Fund programs for fiscal year 2022 to 2026, which would begin in October of this year. This plan is also unique, as you can see in the graph on the left, and that includes much more than transportation infrastructure, but broadband, water, and power as well. In the following discussion, it is important to remember that nothing has been finalized into law yet. Any information shared here is subject to change. So look and see how we got to that $274 billion in new transportation funding, as you can see on the graph. And we're not going to discuss today the energy, interior, and some of these other department fundings for power, broadband, and so forth. As for our transportation priorities in the Senate bill, we have 550 in new spending in total for everything. In the case of transportation, the baseline, which it makes reference to, is the FAST Act, which apportioned about $293.5 billion. Of the $550 billion in new spending, 110 specifically more is provided for roads and bridges. Highway safety programs increased by 11 billion, public transit by almost 40 billion more. Rail gets quite a bit, 66 billion. With that, this brings the total to 567.6 billion as the bottom line for total spending on surface transportation, of which 274 billion is new money in the pocket of the Department of Transportation. Across the board, all of the funding levels for the various programs we are familiar with is going to increase. In the last year of the FAST Act, 63.5 billion was given to federal aid highway programs and transit between the trust fund and the general fund. The Senate bill increases this number to almost 91 billion. This new spending is divided between apportion programs, such as the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, and non-apportion programs or allocation programs. Because this bill did not address some of the underlying issues with highway trust fund solvency, such as maybe increasing gas tax or other user fees, it's going to be heavily supplemented by the general fund. Unfortunately, apportionments to states still follow the same data based on population, vehicle miles traveled, and other metrics as they were gathered in the early 2000s for the Safety Lou Bill, a previous Surface Transportation Authorization Act. This means Arizona is roughly going to get about 1.86% of formula funding in this bill, as it did in the last 3 surface transportation authorizations. As you know, because Arizona is a growing state, this number from the early 2000s is unfortunately going to give us a little bit less of the share than we ought to deserve. The good news is that we may receive up to 5.3 billion in apportionments for all FHWA programs, or around 1.07 billion per year. This is going to be a respectable increase from the 3.9 billion we received under the 5 years of the FAST Act. In fact, this brings us from about 775 million per year in federal money to over 1 billion. But keep in mind in all the following discussions that these are all apportionments, which are often greater than the actual money that's going to hit the ledger. So I'll briefly just kind of go through some of the programs that are bigger and that we have particular interest in here in the state of Arizona and the PAG region. So the first one is National Highway Performance Program, largely directed by the state. The Senate bill is going to increase funding for this program from 24.2 billion under the FAST Act to 29.6 billion, or about a 22% increase. Arizona could receive about 2.7 billion over 5 years, or 541 million per year on average. This is a modest increase from the 430 million we saw on average from the FAST Act. Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, one we are very interested in, is going to add about an additional 2.2 billion funding, which is going to be included in this new bill, raising it from 10.4 to 12.6 nationwide. So that's about a 20% increase. Of that, Arizona could receive up to about 1.2 billion over 5 years. This increases the annual amount from 200 million under the FAST Act to about 237 million in the Senate bill. Preliminary calculations suggest that the PAG region could see maybe about 3 million more in STVG funding, about 23.6 million. But what's that assumption, however? We're assuming that the population numbers are the same as they were in the past, which of course is likely going to change a little bit. However, I would suspect that given the increase in funding nationwide, we will see a little bit more of that money to our region. Transportation alternatives increases vastly under the Senate bill from about 850 million to about 1.4 billion, or 70%. This brings Arizona's expected apportionment from about 78 million a year to 131.6 million, or about 26.3 million on average. The Highway Safety Improvement Program also increasing. The most recent FAST Act supplied about 2.41 billion. This is going to increase to an annual average of about 3.1 billion over the 5 years of the Senate bill, or a total of about 15.5 billion. Of that, Arizona could receive about 292 million, or 58 million per year. Same old story with the National Freight Program as well, where we are seeing an increase. For Arizona, this means we can see around 23 million more over the course of 5 years, bringing Arizona up to about 132 million for the duration of the program. The Carbon Reduction Program is going to be a new program in this bill, which was not in the FAST Act. It requires states to develop carbon reduction strategies. It provides about 6.4 billion over 5 years, or 1.3 billion per year on average. Of that, Arizona could see 117 million over the 5 years, or 23.4 million per year. The PROTECT grants are also new for pre-disaster mitigation and resiliency. And funding in them is both formulaic and discretionary, so we'll focus on the formulaic portion. This funding is meant to help reduce vulnerability of transportation infrastructure to costly and destructive storms, flooding, and other acts of nature. It would also help communities and states plan for future risk and employ nature-based methods to reduce flood and storm damages. Of the 7.3 billion available, Arizona could receive about 133.4 million, or 26.7 million per year. We'll also see a little bit of money coming through for electric vehicles and alternative fuel charging corridors. Senate bill provides about 912 million over 5 years, and of this, Arizona could receive about 76.5 million over 5 years, or 15.2 million per year. The big priority of this bill is bridge replacement and rehabilitation. It's adding an additional 26 billion on top of former levels, which were apportioned under the FAST Act. This is a formulaic portion. There's even more money under the discretionary portion grant program of this bridge replacement program. Arizona could receive almost 225 million in total, or 45 million per year. In addition to the formula programs, there's also 20.2 billion provided in allocated programs. The distribution of federal aid highway funding on any basis other than a statutory formula is called an allocation. FHWA may make an allocation at any time during the fiscal year compared to apportionments, which by law have to be on October 1st. In most cases, FHWA divides allocated funds among states or other eligible entities for qualifying projects based on criteria provided in law. Some discretionary grants include the infra grant, which we can see at the bottom. No matter what we're looking at, whether it be federal lands, tribal transportation, they're all going up. So there should be ample money available should we qualify for these grants. And let's not forget about transit, which will receive an additional almost 40 billion in new spending, closing out at about 70 billion in contract authority and general fund advances. This is going to be about a 40% increase. Arizona could receive up to $900 million per year in transit funding, up from about $600 million under FAST Act levels. One of the more striking parts of this bill is passenger rail funding. Amtrak is set to receive $66 billion, far more than it has in recent memory. This is about a 40% increase. Oh, sorry. In fact, this apportionment of the $66 billion is equal to about the last 18 years worth of Federal Rail Administration funding. I conclude with the next steps to passage. The FAST Act will expire on September 30, 2021. Currently, the U.S. House of Representatives is set to vote on this Senate bill prior to September 30th, in fact, by the 27th. If something happens along the way and the bill is not signed into law by the 30th, a continuing resolution will be required to continue operations with the federal aid highway programs. And with that, Madam Chair, members of the committee, I conclude my presentation.
All right, great. David, thank you very much for that very thorough description. That's probably the most information that I've personally gotten about the contents of the BIB and the potential to Arizona, or the potential increase in revenues to Arizona. Any questions or comments for David? All right. Seeing none, I guess that is our last item. So looks like we're ready to transition to our technical management. I'll entertain a motion for adjournment.
Motion to adjourn, Madam Chair.
All right, a motion by Terry. Did I hear a second? I see Carmine's mouth move. So
Second.
That was good enough for me. All right, seconded by Carmine. All those in favor of adjournment signify by saying aye.
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 Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries. All right, we are adjourned from the Management Committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Okay, so we're going to pause shortly for all the members to join us. Let's just confirm that we are streaming, correct? We're streaming. Okay, you're good to go, Mr. Chair.
Okay, do we have an approval of the September 9th meeting summary minutes?
Minutes are in your packet and we're hoping for a motion.
Looks like we have a motion to approve.
Motion to approve.
Second, all in favor? Aye. Any objections? No.
Aye.
Minutes are approved. Okay, next item is the RTA Next Plan Development Update. And Jim DeGroot.
Okay, Mr. Chair, members of the TMC, I'm going to give you a brief update on where we stand with the RTA Next Plan. First, the CAC has discussed and has forwarded a set of priorities. Those include reducing congestion, providing efficient cross-town mobility, improving transit ridership, reducing crashes at intersections, reducing wildlife-related crashes, improving the conditions of existing roadways, providing safer bicycle and pedestrian facilities, maintaining or improving air quality, improving access to workplaces, and adding functionality to key corridors. The RTA board also requested that project submittals be made by June 30, 2020. We have received submittals from most jurisdictions. We are still awaiting the City of Tucson project list as they move through their Move Tucson program. The Citizens Advisory Committee was delegated the responsibility for developing a plan, and the original terms of those committee members is now expired. Committee members wishing to continue were reappointed for 3 more years, and the committee was continued. The RTA board may add additional members to bring the committee back up to 35 members, and has set forth a process for for identifying new candidates. The applications for membership are open and close tomorrow. So anybody wishing to submit their application has until close of business tomorrow to do it online. That'd be happy to answer your questions.
Any questions of Mr. DeGroot? Doesn't appear to be any questions, so let's move on to
Okay.
the next is the RTA revenue update.
Okay, this is the
Mr.
fun
DeGroot.
part. Mr. Chair, members of the TMC, pleased to advise you that we finished our budget last year, fiscal 21, very strongly. We had anticipated very poor revenues as a result of the pandemic. In fact, we saw quite the opposite, finishing the year almost $22 million ahead of what we had budgeted. If you'll recall, we had budgeted a 15% decline from our baseline forecast. We exceeded that by 28.2%. In fact, we even saw almost 12% year-over-year growth, which is unprecedented in our history. We have started the current year very strong. We went back to the baseline budget, estimating or using the LR estimate that they had developed for us back in 2019. And we had set the budget in May at $94.4 million. We are right now well ahead of that, at least for the first 2 months, with our year-over-year growth of 20+% in July. Now, that corresponds with the month of May, which if you look back a year ago, May of 2020 was the first month that we were reopening from the pandemic. So that was not a big surprise there, but the August number was somewhat surprising because it's not typically a large revenue month. That corresponds with the month of June. Many people are out of town. So we are trending very positively. In terms of RTP collections month over month, you can see the graph there that shows the comparison from prior years, August 2019 being unaffected or pre-pandemic, kind of on the normal trend we had been seeing. Part of that, August 20, the first one of the early months into the or after the stay-at-home orders had lapsed, and then this year's. Some things that I wanted to point out, kind of an oddity, in fact, was how well our hospitality-related TPT collections are. We kind of have lumped together in the past the amusements, the restaurant and bar sales, and the hotel tax revenues, and clustered them together, called them hospitality-related TPT collections. We've seen a great deal of variability in it, as we all expected. It really suffered probably the most of any of the industry groups at the beginning of the pandemic. It has resoundingly, particularly the bar and restaurant sales have come back very strongly. And in fact, we set a record in May of 2021 for the amount of bar and restaurant sales. And that's the month of collection or the month of retail activity, not the month that we took the deposit. So just thought I would note that for you. One other thing that is of interest is the amusements component of this, which consists primarily of things like movie theaters, concerts, and such. That has started to come back and is approaching what it was looking like pre-pandemic. But we are now tracking a new industry group with the current budget, and the Arizona Department of Revenue is reporting to us marijuana sales, which kind of caught us by surprise. The combination of medical marijuana and adult recreational marijuana, those two sales together were almost $20.2 million in the month of May. So that was a big surprise for us. So anyway, with that, Mr. Chair, also did want to point out that we are continuing to track the remote marketplace facilitated TPT, basically your internet sales, and those remain strong. We're starting to see it kind of level off at about 9.5% of our total retail, as compared to about 6.5%, which was pre-pandemic. Some observations, very favorable conditions continue to persist, although that's probably stimulated by the economic stimulus, federal stimulus money. And we are doing a new forecast with the Eller Business Research Center, and they are going to be presenting us an updated forecast that will bring forward the board in December. And one other observation we've kind of noted is that one of the things that we're starting to shift, and one of the things we were tracking with the with Eller, was this long-term movement towards the use of or consumers preferring services to goods, and that's kind of changed a bit with the pandemic, where services have been less heavily used, and people are going back and shifting to buying more or consuming more goods. And that's something that we'll watch. That may be something that is worth looking at, whether it's a sustaining trend or not. And with that, Mr. Chair, that concludes my report. Sorry. We are looking at other trends. That includes the gasoline sales and Perf. They did fall quite a bit, although Perf collections were about what we had planned for last fiscal year. They were flat relative to our forecast, where we had anticipated a decline, and we saw the decline in the gasoline component of it. What we are going to be very interested in is to determine whether or not the Perf is negatively impacted by the shortage of new automobiles that are available. That's something that made up in some part for the loss of gasoline revenue in the Perf last year. We may not be so fortunate this year. Adam.
Any questions for Mr. DeGroot on the financial forecast?
Mr. Chairman, good job, Jim, with explaining that. I'd really like to get a copy of presentations. If we could get all of those, I'd appreciate that.
We'll post that online, and we certainly welcome to go into greater detail.
Can you go back 2 slides? I think it's 2 or 3 slides where you show the cycles.
The hospitality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just curious. Obviously, it shows a pretty cyclical. What are you thinking in terms of the future and kind of projecting out what it looks like going forward? Are you hearing anything on that?
Yeah. As we're watching the entertainment sector, one of the things we've noted is that we've seen pretty close to recovery in the transient housing, or the bed tax, if you will. That's come back. It's about what it was a year ago, or 2 years ago rather. And so we're seeing that coming back. We know there's an appetite for more travel, although with current conditions that may be dampening a bit. Unclear. The entertainment side of things, as venues begin to reopen, and to what level they open in terms of capacity, that's something that's also unclear. But it's even with that, we've seen some of that or basically the entertainment's pretty close to what it was 2 years ago. One of the things that we don't know is whether or not it's due to volume of sales or whether it's cost of sales. One of the things that we couldn't tell you, for instance, on the restaurant and bar sales, we couldn't tell you whether or not that's more meals served or the meals are served at a higher price. So those are things that we can't discern with the data we've got, but we probably think we will look at that.
You also normally project out what it's going to look like. And that's using Eller's models, not just on hospitality, but just in general. Have you done that yet?
We typically rely pretty heavily on the Economic Business Research Center, and what we do is we look at kind of a resiliency approach. We look at a optimistic and a pessimistic forecast along with our baseline, kind of look at operating conservatively within that band.
Reason, Mr. Chairman, I'm interested is obviously that potential growth helps to deal with shortfalls and so I'm just curious as to what that number might look like, what it's projected to be. But I know your crystal ball is as good as everybody's, but I know that Eller is really working hard at that. I'm just curious if you guys have.
Yeah, in fact, we are, Mr. Ortega, we are looking at that right now. We expect to provide some information to the board as we're working through that, and we develop more.
When do you expect to have that?
Shooting for a presentation this month.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
So yeah, we'll do a more exhaustive presentation to the board.
Just to clarify, Mr. Chair, that's based on current information. We are working with Eller to get updated information. That won't be available until after December.
Yeah, that's absolutely.
Sorry, that's what I was curious about.
Yeah, that one we're working on it. And as Jim mentioned, obviously they're asking some of the same questions. What's the impact of the pandemic and pre-pandemic, post-pandemic? So there's a lot of questions that we're hoping that they'll be able to shed some light on.
If I were to characterize how our revenue is performing relative to the prior Eller forecast, we're at or exceeding the optimistic forecast. So we'll have a revisitation of that forecast.
Thanks.
And just as a reminder, we do that every 3 years, and obviously it just happens to be a very kind of a dynamic 3-year history here. So they're requesting for a little extra time to get some data that they can actually utilize to understand the impact of the pandemic.
So I appreciate every 3 years, all I'm suggesting is given what's going on, both in terms of the pandemic as well as the recovery and the chemistry of all of those pieces. That's why I'm interested. So it's very timely. This happens to be the 3 years.
Exactly, and they're asking all the right questions, and we hope that we can ask them to try to project and tell us what they think is going to happen.
I would encourage you all to, Mr. Chairman, maybe as just a suggestion that you send these out with the materials. I was looking forward to try to follow along. It'd be helpful to get the presentations with the materials if possible.
Be happy to, again, as you all recognize, we try to get the agenda out a week ahead of time. Some of these presentations are fresh off the printer. We've been working on it.
Brian.
We've been working on it, so we'll do our best, but in many cases, the presentations are prepared just prior to the meeting, but we will send you the information.
It's just helpful so we can look at them
Yeah, I
ahead of
think-
time, that's all. We're all in the same boat.
Even if you send them,
Yeah.
Yeah,
Even if
get
they're
them,
late,
send them the day
fine,
before.
not a conflict. If we get them, we'll get them. If not, we'll get them here.
Message received. Certainly we can send out at least early versions. One of the things that we're waiting for right now is Department of Revenue should drop a deposit in the next day or so. And I can update these graphs in 24 hours. So
Thanks.
We'll do that.
Okay, any other questions for Jim on the financial? If not, let's move on to the next item, the Rta President's update.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll go real quickly through this. First of all, we've got a number of projects. It's been almost a year since we met last, so this is not new news. The most recent 3 projects that were completed were Rta, Broadway Boulevard on the east end, and Valencia Road, Ajo to Wade. Those all have been kind of post-pandemic completions. In terms of projects that are currently under construction, Broadway Boulevard Euclid Country Club, that's moving along. They're doing base paving right now. They're working towards the eastern end of the project. Campbell intersection was closed a couple of weekends ago, and they paved through it. Now they're paving on either side. We expect that project to be completed in early 22. It's been delayed a little bit due to some unforeseen utility conflicts. So that's slowed down the project a bit. But what we expect to really find the project is complete. The Ruth Roth I-10 UPRR overpass, that's getting back into operation. The state has been opening up lanes a bit at a time as they've felt comfortable with opening it. We now have most of the operations supported, so you can go over the interstate. You can some of the ramps are open. They expect the complete project to be finished this later this calendar year. Downtown links, again, construction's ongoing. A lot of work being done. The Stone Avenue underpass is the most recent reopening. 6th Avenue's underpass is now closed. And the next major group of work that's going to be put out is going to be related to the railroad over at the existing 6th Street rail crossing. It's currently targeted for spring of 23. Houghton Road on the very east side, Valencia to Marianne Cleveland is probably going to wrap up shortly after the year ends. This will, once it's open, will mark completion of Houghton continuously between Irvington Road on the north and Interstate 10. And this is timing also very well with the Interstate 10 improvements with the new interchange there. In terms of other projects that are moving ahead, these are projects that will be going to construction next calendar year. Grant Road, stages 3 and 4. Most of the right-of-way has been acquired. Utility coordination is ongoing. That's our relocation efforts. And plans are complete. We expect to go to construction this summer. The stages 5 and 6 are in design. The 22nd Street Viaduct, the city has selected a CMAR team, and construction is anticipated to get underway in earnest in 2022. Silver Bell Road, Gore to El Camino del Cerro. The cultural work has been finished, and utility relocations are expected in early 22. They're finalizing right now. Valencia Road, now this is pushing into 23. Valencia Road, Kolb to Houghton. That project approaching 60% design, and the acquisition discussions with the State Land Department, which is the big landholder that we have to deal with. We expect that to go to construction in mid-23. Sunset Road, I-10 River Road, plans are approaching 60%, and UPRR is working with the county on the crossing concept. Project was federalized, and we did provide some additional construction, or will be providing additional construction funding if the TIP amendment that was presented earlier today is approved. UPRR underpass at Grant Road, that's the design effort has been kicked off again. They took it to a point with concept. What they're looking at right now is doing, rather than widening the underpass at Grant Road, they're looking at separating the bicycle and pedestrian facilities, putting them on a separate structure to the south of the interchange there, and tying it into the Santa Cruz River. Houghton Road, Irvington to 22nd, that'll probably go late in 2023. That will take or fill in the gap between the 22nd Street to Broadway phase and the Irvington piece to the south. And with that, happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Mr. DeGrood? Only question I have, Jim, is there's probably a number of projects that aren't listed in this list. Do we have a list of those?
We certainly have a list of those projects. These are the projects that are the furthest along, right, and the ones that we would expect to see go to construction in 22 to 23. We do have an additional list, and we can certainly provide additional updates as we care to see.
The only reason I bring it up is I know that there's some discussion that some of these projects are maybe, the jurisdiction might have different views now, 20 years later, as to implementation of those and whether or not we should go back and, query the jurisdictions to say, is there anything on this list that you think should be used, could be done differently? And if so, which ones? I know that the board has adopted the pledge, but pledge 20 years stale is something that probably ought to be revisited from time to time. So I think we ought to give the jurisdictions the opportunity to at least have some input as to are the projects that are still out there but not implemented in any significant manner still important? Should they be used? Should they in fact have conditions change so much that the project probably is not warranted? And if it's not warranted, perhaps the money that's allocated by the RTA to that project could be allocated to that jurisdiction to finish another RTA project they think is higher priority. Just throwing it out for discussion.
Mr. Chairman, I think there's value in having a conversation. I think it would be value to maybe ask a question. I think what we have to be cognizant of is the voter promise, if you will. What does that look like? And what is that conversation? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think the important part is trying to balance, what was indicated to the voters 20 years ago versus what the reality is on the ground today. And then being able to adequately explain that to someone who will hopefully not question whether or not the project's still valid, but understand that changing conditions change priorities. I think what we probably ought to do is as the RTA, allow the jurisdictions to revisit those projects where there hasn't been any significant movement at all on them, and determine what they believe the future of that project might be. And it may be that you continue, and that's fine. It may be that we have a different priority and we'd like to see another RTA project advanced sooner within their jurisdiction.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Good point. Obviously, with the remaining 5 years, we typically try to look at the first 2 years of the program, but a really good point. We can reach out to the TMC members and ask the TMC members to provide feedback based on the conversation that we just had. And that would be really fruitful in the conversation as we start looking at not only the following 2 years, but the entire 5 years.
And I realize it's going to be a conversation that has to convince a lot of people that it needs to be altered. And so if you create an environment that everybody understands why a particular issue or matter is being recommended for resolution the way it is, then the better probability you have that the board will ultimately accept that process.
So we'll do that. We'll reach out to the TMC members and request for feedback on that information.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's go on to item 6, which is a review of supplemental funding notices.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the TMC. We did issue a notice of funding availability on July 9th. This was based upon what we presented to the board at the May meeting for a budget. We had identified that there would be some funding that would be available. We had identified approximately $30 million that would be available for projects that were over and above the amounts that were necessary to meet the ballot commitments on each of the projects. We know that there are projects that are expected to cost more than were identified in the 2006 RTA plan. We also, so we asked those projects that were in the near term, either in construction or going to construction within the 22 to 23 fiscal years. We asked that those be identified. We also made available the opportunity to accelerate projects that are already in this fiscal year 22 to 26 TIP that may be in an outer year, and there may be an opportunity to advance that project. And finally, we recognize that there may be the opportunity to advance projects but those projects would also keep additional money beyond what's in the RTA ballot. So that those were the 3 items that we'd identified on PERF. Again, as I mentioned, we did develop a tip that was fiscally constrained and identified additional funding. And the board did adopt a $30 million amount for this next 2 years. I would add that that budget could be augmented because one of the things is, as I noted in the financial report, is we finished last fiscal year $22 million ahead of what we had budgeted for. So that could also be made available as well. That is funding that is uncommitted at this time. It would be the up to the RTA board's approval and IGA amendments that would be needed to augment project funding beyond the amount that is in the RTA ballot, or RTA plan. We did receive 4 requests that totaled $47.6 million. As one of the projects I would note applied also for federal funding, and there was approximately $7 million of federal funding available, both through the STBG funding that we spoke about at the last meeting, as well as PRISA funds that are also available. One of the things that we wanted to do is make sure that the CART committee was informed of what was going on. We have a CART committee tomorrow scheduled. We also had a subcommittee of the CART formed called the Project Scope and Funding Subcommittee. They met on August 24th, and they made a couple of recommendations. This was unanimously approved, and that was that the 4 specific NOFA responses be presented to the board with documentation to confirm that they're eligible, that they are eligible RTA costs and within the scope of the voter plan, and that there is a demonstrated justification for the need to exceed the expenditures that were identified in the RTA plan approved by the voters, as well as statutes and policies. And that the second part of that motion was that any future project funding requests also be analyzed under the same standards so that they're confirmed to be eligible for RTA costs within the scope, and that there's a justification for the need to exceed the ballot amount. The administrative code, which the TMC was key in developing and adopted initially in 2006, and it's been amended a couple of times, limits items for regionally funded projects pursuant to the RTA statutes, and also have identified fund or items that are disallowed. One is optional items that are being added beyond the scope of the project. We did establish funding caps for things such as art and landscaping, utility relocation expenses that are not covered by prior rights, and the project elements that are the responsibilities of another entity. We did also include language that calls for funding of redesign costs by the entity that's making the change to the scope of the project. Additional costs due to modification of the scope are certainly acceptable, and in our policies we allow for that so long as they don't diminish functionality and the lead agency provides the funding. But all of these are consistent with our function. The letters following the Park Subcommittee meeting, we did send out letters to all of those applicants for additional funds, requesting that they identify quantitatively and characterize the reasons for the additional funding requested. There was some information that was provided in the original NOFA responses, but we felt that we needed to go into greater detail on that. We are looking for confirmation that the funding requests are consistent with the RTA plan project scope, and that the reimbursement eligibility requirements are met. And we've added a request for additional funding. If there is additional funding, where there are additional funding requests, the details be provided, and further detail beyond what's in the original NOFA response. I would add, we've already been reached out to by all of the jurisdictions that submitted them, and much of that material has already been delivered to us. That, Mr. Chair, be happy to answer any questions.
The origin of the $29 million is,
In the 2020 or 22 to 26 tip, we did not program fully the funding. We had in the tip document itself, which had a constrained, call it a COVID constrained revenue forecast. We
Might
had
actually help if you go back to your budget slide. So the budget that was adopted, we projected a potential revenue decline in fiscal year 21. And as Jim mentioned, we actually saw a much more robust revenue coming in. So that's the delta. But if you go back to that slide, it really helps.
I'm not sure.
If you're able to go back to the slide.
I'm gonna have to go way
So
back.
we budgeted very conservatively, and in reality, to everyone's surprise, the economy and the sales tax revenues were doing relatively well. So that's the delta.
So it's Mr. Chairman, it's excess revenues or?
Yes.
Yeah,
So there you go. Your actual, there you go, right there.
right there, yeah. In short, we planned for, even in the constrained revenue environment, $20 million of funding to be available. We added to that, we basically took our fiscal 22 budget and increased it up to baseline from the LR forecast. And that's how we went from 20 million to 29 and almost $30 million. And then we have, as you can see on this graph, we finished last year $22 million strong of our budget. So that would also be available if we chose to include that. But the budget itself was only the planned funding in the tip plus the increase in revenue from the pandemic constrained revenue forecast to the baseline.
so the 29 million is it a mix of state funds, RTA, sales tax?
Just RTA
Just
funds. So if
RTA.
you look at the adopted 21 budget, it was roughly $78 million. The actual 21 was, oh, go back, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, we
Actual
budgeted
20
77.
The actual 21 was roughly $100 million. There's the delta. It was purely RTA
So
sales
this
tax.
is not 29 plus 22.
It is, actually, the 22 is not addressed in the budget.
See, that's 22.
That's 22. That would be over and above the 29. Right.
So the 29 is all RTA money.
Correct.
22 is all RTA money.
Correct.
So in reality, you've got 51.
Correct.
And you're in the process to allocate 29,
Correct.
not the 22.
That was what was approved in the budget. Yes.
Got it.
The budget was adopted prior to close of the year, so we didn't know what we were working.
What process are you going to do to address the 22 excess?
As part of the current NOFA, as Jim mentioned, the requests are roughly $47 million.
Right.
So the board can choose to go beyond the 29 and allocate additional funds.
So in reality, the board has $51 million allocated. Right. Okay. Good. Fine. All right. Questions I had. Anybody else have any questions for Jim? Okay. If not, I think the next item is adjournment. Is there a
Is there a
motion?
motion on that? Was there direction on that or is that?
No, that's just more information. And again, thanks to everyone, as Jim mentioned, we do need that additional information. The information is trickling in, so we hope that we would have all the information so we can process those requests.
Okay, and those requests come from,
Individual
Jurisdictions.
entities, we had total of 4 projects that requested for additional funding. That makes up the $47 million request.
I would add that those are projects that will be going, either are under construction or will be going into construction in fiscal 22 or 23.
And the list is in your packet. If you like, we can talk a little bit more in detail on each project, but there are definitely projects that you're all familiar with, and we believe that ideally within the next 2 years, most of them should be under construction, or all of them should be under construction.
Chairman, that's why I was asking, because I've got two under construction, they're in need of dollars, so we're going to make sure that the dollars are there, because.
Yeah, so the capacity is there.
The 4 projects are,
Broadway, Downtown Links, Tangerine, Sunset.
and the greatest probability for significant additional federal funding would go to probably Sunset.
That is the only federal project, yes.
So it's basically you fund the others, possibly Tangerine. And question is how real is, well, I think the fact that it's under design on Sunset, that connection is pretty important and probably should score well on any federal funding allocations.
So on that note, at the previous meeting, we approved additional federal funding for Sunset. And then there was also a NOFA for additional federal funding that came through the CARES Act. That was recommended for additional funding for Sunset as well.
Okay. Sounds good. All right, is there a motion to adjourn? Somebody made a motion. There's a second. We're adjourned. Thank you.
Second,
Okay.
Thank you.
We're adjourned already. Mary,
Thank
so-
you.
Want to make sure.
Sure.